Good afternoon. We'll give everybody else just another minute or two before we get started. And I hope y'all are staying warm. This weather is freaking cold. And something's wrong with my thermostat in my house, so I'm freezing my butt off over here. We'll just wait another minute or so, and then we'll get started. I guess in the meantime, does anybody have any questions about anything? Did everybody have, was everybody able to submit their homework? Okay, good. Holy cow, yeah, that's crazy. Whew. I'm so glad I don't live up there. I do like the cold if there's snow to play in. But if there's no snow, I can do without the cold. Yeah. Yeah. My parents live in Reno, Nevada, and they got a bunch of snow too. So I like to go skiing. So I over spring break I'll probably be in Reno doing some snow skiing. So I might be joining you from Nevada for a class or two. I don't know. We'll see. My spring breaks don't overlap necessarily, so I think. Although actually, I think since you guys made me aware of what peak week is, I think Georgia State spring break might overlap with peak week. I mean, I can't remember, but okay. Let's go ahead and get started. All right, so this is where we left off last time. We were looking at sort of leading causes of death by age range. And there were several takeaways. You know, probably the least surprising one was that as we get into older age groups, there's a higher death rate. So more people die per 100,000 people. And then I guess probably the more interesting thing is sort of how the cause of death shifts away from accidents and suicide and homicide towards diseases that are more or less related to lifestyle choices, right? So we can kind of review these things here, right? So for people under 44, the leading causes of death are still accidents for the most part, and then to some degree suicides and homicides. I think one thing I didn't mention that your book talks about is the fact that most of these suicide and homicide deaths are related to mental illness. And that's an aspect of health that is kind of ignored to a certain degree, right? When we talk about healthcare in this class and in just in general, we're mostly talking about like, standard medicine, right? Like surgeries and going to the doctor and getting what are they called? When you get checked out by your doctor, just in general, physicals. That's what the word I was looking for. Going for physicals and those sorts of things. We're not yet to a point where we focus as much on mental health, but it may be. It's at least just as important, if not maybe more important than physical health. So mental health could be a contributing factor to a lot of these diseases, as well as lifestyle choices. So I did want to mention that. But again, as we can see, as we get into these older age groups, the leading cause of deaths changes from accidents and suicides and homicides to things like cancer and heart disease, and then stroke and liver disease start making their way in there, and then they are much more predominant in these older age groups. So so that's where we left off. Right. So the main takeaways, first of all, the sort of, I guess the primary takeaway is that we're shifting from these sort of accidents and other violent deaths to other causes that are influenced by lifestyle choices. And tobacco is probably the most dangerous lifestyle choice, tobacco use. It is more heavily associated with these top causes of death than almost any other aspect of lifestyle. So, of course, lung cancer, but also other cancers, heart disease, respiratory problems like COPD. Right, tobacco is highly associated with all of these, almost all of these sort of causes of death. So that's a huge impact on lifestyle choice, and we're going to look at that in a little more detail. And then aside from tobacco use, obesity and lack of exercise, or what's sometimes called a sedentary lifestyle, are also heavily associated with a lot of these things, heart disease in particular, but also certain types of cancer and other problems. So we're going to talk about obesity as well in a little bit more detail. And we're going to start off by looking at some empirical evidence from two separate studies. The original study was by McGinnis, and I think this person's name is Fogg. They did a study in 1993 using some data from 1990. And then almost 10 years later, Muqdad et al. Basically replicated the study using updated data from the year 2000. So we're going to take a look at that evidence here. So what they did was they estimated or imputed the actual cause of death, right? So what we were looking at earlier were, things like heart disease, cancer, stroke, right? So these were the official listed cause of death on the death certificate. Now, what these researchers did was they tried to find the underlying cause of those causes, right? So they were able to sort of aggregate and determine the actual cause of death, whether it was tobacco use, right, that led to things like heart disease and stroke or cancer, or if it was alcohol abuse, right? So what we're looking at here are the results of those two studies. The dark gray bar is the study using the year 2000 data. So that was Muqdad et al. And then the lighter gray is the earlier original study. So there's a lot of interesting things in this. So I guess the first thing to note here is that these deaths that are represented in this graph represent about 50% of all deaths in the United States in these years. So it's not this, there's other deaths, right? There's 50% of deaths that we're not accounting for. So keep that in mind. But I kind of want to get your guys' opinion on what your takeaway is from this. Do you see anything interesting here that you think is noteworthy?
Sorry, could you explain what microbial agents would be?
Microbial agents, yeah, that's
Yeah.
basically like bacterial infections.
Okay.
Yeah. So infections, that you need antibiotics for, basically. And then toxic agents are things like pollution, mostly pollution, but things like that, like arsenic in your water or lead in water, things like that. Yeah. So is there anything interesting that y'all see here?
I think it's interesting that tobacco deaths have gone up since the 90s because I feel like it's a lot more people are a lot more aware of the harmful effects of it, especially with like the social media campaigns and everything. So I think that's interesting.
Okay, yeah, good point. So let's talk about that for a second. Um, so uh, be aware that these are just pure numbers, right? So just numbers of deaths. It's not adjusted per capita or anything. So what might be happening there is that the population has grown, right? So that could be part of what we're seeing, because this is not a per capita measure. So it could just be the fact that the population was bigger in 2000 compared to 1990. I'm not sure if that's the reason, but that could be it. Because I would expect the same thing. I think smoking has declined in popularity, but you also have to keep in mind that there's like a lagged effect, right? So people dying in 2000 from tobacco use had probably been using tobacco for decades before then, right? So that there's also that issue. But that is something interesting there. Anything else? Anybody notices? What do you notice about obesity and exercise? Particularly the difference between 1990 and 2000.
Death related incidents have gone up considerably.
Yeah. Yeah, so that's pretty interesting. So we'll see in a second a graph that really illustrates this very well. But basically, since about the 1990s, the early 1990s, we've been facing an obesity epidemic as a country. So for whatever reason, and we're going to talk about some potential causes, but for whatever reason, it seems that more and more people are obese, or even extremely obese. So that's an interesting thing to take away. Some other interesting things I noticed. Um, what's the lowest cause of death in this chart?
Drug use,
Drug use, yeah. And what's the highest?
tobacco.
Does anybody find that interesting? One of those things is illegal and the other's not, right? There's been a drug war ongoing for almost 3 decades now, but it seems to have a very low impact on cause of death, right? So that was kind of interesting to me. Seems like maybe we should focus more on reducing tobacco use than reducing the use of illegal drugs. Let's see. Is there anything else interesting here? I think that's about it as far as what I noticed. But you see, the studies, the replicated study very closely mirrors the original study. So that's good. That's an indication that um, there's some scientific integrity, right? The results were replicated. Um, aside from obesity, but we can attribute that to this obesity epidemic that we've been seeing here. So um, let's see, what else did I have here? Okay, so some other things to note. So the top three actual causes of death: tobacco, diet/activity patterns, and alcohol. are attributed to almost 40% of all deaths. So that's pretty high. Most of that coming from tobacco and obesity or activity patterns, but to a pretty high degree, alcohol abuse. So arguably, almost all of these things have to do with lifestyle choices, right? The only one that maybe doesn't is microbial agents and toxic agents. But even microbial agents might have something to do with lifestyle. And your book talks about the fact that somebody might have died from a microbial agent because they had AIDS, right? Which is related to lifestyle choice in terms of having unprotected sex and whatnot. But so while that may be the listed cause, the ultimate cause was microbial. So even though, to a large degree, microbial infections really aren't heavily associated with lifestyle, some of those deaths may still have something to do with lifestyle. And then on top of that, like I said, toxic agents is the other one that kind of isn't really necessarily associated with lifestyle. It has more to do with like the activities of society, right? So pollution, things that generate pollution and toxins in our environment, right? So those have more to do with the activities of society rather than individual lifestyle choices. But pretty much everything else on this in this chart has directly to do with lifestyle choices, right? Particularly the ones that have a very large negative impact on health, tobacco and obesity. All right. So we're going to talk about some of these in more detail, right? So a more detailed look at consumption and health. So I found this lovely picture because it basically illustrates all four of the details that we're going to look at, right? So we have someone who looks like they're overweight, if not obese, smoking cigarettes, drinking beer, and I would not be surprised if this person has a low level of education. Can't really determine it from this picture, but we can guess, right? So obesity, right? We're going to take a look at obesity. Obviously, being severely overweight has a drastic negative impact on health. That was the number 2 cause of death that we saw in the last chart. Tobacco use, of course, was number 1. Although given the trends in obesity, obesity might actually overtake tobacco use as the number 1 cause, if it hasn't already. This is the 5th edition of this book, so this data is a little outdated, but so it may be the case that obesity already has overtaken tobacco use as the number 1 cause of death. But tobacco use is kind of interesting in particular because of the addictive nature, right? So that's kind of something interesting about that. Although, food can be addictive too, but it's not quite as addictive as tobacco. Nicotine is, I think, the second most addictive substance. And the only thing that's worse is heroin. So then we're going to look at alcohol use, which is pretty interesting because there are some things there that you might not expect. Alcohol use has some complicated relationships with health, and we're going to talk about that. And then we're also going to talk about education and how education affects health. And what we will see is that in general, higher levels of education are highly associated with better health. So, which I don't think should be very surprising, but we'll see why. All right, but first of all, let's start with obesity. So like I said, we have an obesity epidemic in America. Okay, so we saw that obesity, one of the most striking observations we made was the large increase in deaths related to obesity and lack of exercise, right? So here's a chart showing the percentages of the population that fall into these 3 different categories: overweight, obese, and extremely obese, which are based on body mass index. So Interestingly, the percent of our population that's overweight has actually been fairly constant, right around 33%, going all the way back to 1960 up until 2008. So that's kind of interesting to me that it hasn't really changed a lot. But what has changed is the percentage of our population that's considered obese and extremely obese. So those have been on the rise since somewhere around the 1980s. And now roughly a third of our population is obese and about 5% is extremely obese. And all in total, this is a really depressing number, but about 75% of our population falls into one of these three categories, which is huge, right? I guess it's a little bit less than 75%, about 70 to 75%. So really bad. So I think the next question, or this begs the question, what the heck is going on that's causing this, right? And there's a lot of things that could potentially be contributing to this. You guys have any guesses? I'm interested in what hypotheses you might have. Anybody, any guesses on what might be happening over time?
It's become cheaper to make really unhealthy food and to buy really unhealthy food.
Yeah, good. That's a good hypothesis, right? Calories have become cheaper, right? Calories have become cheaper over time because of technology, right? So that's definitely probably a contributor. Anything else? Anything that might affect our lifestyle and make us more sedentary?
Computers and like TV is more prominent.
Yeah, exactly. Again, that's again related to technology, right? Good. Okay, yeah, so those were definitely some of them. So possible culprits, technological change, right? That's a main contributor here. So one thing is that, like Blythe said, it has led to a more sedentary lifestyle, both at work and at home. So you can think about how jobs have changed. So more and more, we have more and more jobs that are sort of, desk jobs, right? Fewer people are doing things like manual physical labor and are doing more of these desk type of jobs where you just sit in front of a computer for 8 hours a day, right? But also, similar changes at home, right? Television, computers, our smartphones. We kind of just sit around more and entertain ourselves with these very sedentary types of entertainment, right? So that's one issue that's coming along with technological change. Something else that's maybe not quite as obvious is that because of technological change, average productivity has gone up, which means that average earnings have gone up, which means that it's relatively more expensive to do things like exercise or prepare your own meals. Okay, so think opportunity cost here, right? When people were earning less money because they were less productive, if they decided to go to the gym, they weren't giving up as much in terms of their opportunity cost of exercising. But now that productivity has gone up, it basically costs people more to go to the gym because they have to forego earning money, right? And that cost has increased. And a similar thing with fast food, right? So it's become relatively more expensive to prepare your own meals because you have to, spend time making that meal when you could just sit in a drive-through for 5 minutes and have your meal handed to you through the window, right? And of course, we all know that fast food is not typically a healthy option. Although that is changing a little bit. There are healthier options these days at fast food restaurants, but not that prevalent. So that's one interesting thing too that comes along with technological change. This is the one that Bella mentioned, right? Technology has made calories cheaper. And we all know what happens when things become cheaper, right? Law of demand. We consume more of it. And so that's a major one. And so this one study by Lakdawala and Phillipson in 2002, they estimated that 1/3 of the increase in BMI in recent decades can be attributed to falling food prices, so cheaper calories, and 2/3 of the increase in BMI are due to decreased exertion in normal work activities, so that sedentary lifestyle. Okay, so these two things in combination, right? Cheaper calories and a more sedentary lifestyle are the main contributors to the obesity epidemic that we're seeing. Okay, so those are all things related to technology, but those aren't the only possibilities. All right. We also this I guess is still kind of related to technology, but it's more about, it's also a little bit about lifestyle choices. But about 1/3 of Americans spent their food budget. I'm sorry, Americans spent about 1/3 of their budget for food on restaurant meals in 1970. Today, it's closer to half of their food budget. So people are increasingly eating at restaurants, which is not typically good for health. And in addition to that, they also found that the size of portions has been steadily increasing over time. So this includes both portions at restaurants, as well as portions in like prepackaged meals that you might buy at the grocery store. Pre-made, ready-made meals, right? They found that the size of portions has been going up. And I think that this is probably related to the fact that calories are cheaper, right? Food is cheaper to produce now. So businesses in an attempt to compete, right, are like, hey, look, we give you more food for your money, right? And so they're increasing portion sizes. And you can see that, like, if you've ever seen like those Hungry Man frozen meals, they're like these gigantic frozen meals, like 3,000 calories for a single meal. It's like insane. But like that's part of their marketing. It's like, you get a ton of food with us. You know, get the Hungry Man frozen food package, and you'll be satisfied. um, so another study found that the density of restaurants per capita is one of the strongest explanatory variables. So just the fact that there are more restaurants than there used to be. And this is pretty obvious. I mean, you go out, drive around, and there's just restaurants everywhere. It's like, how is this even possible? How can these places stay in business? There's so many of them, right? But Chu, Grossman, and Saffer found that this was a main explanatory variable in the obesity epidemic. And Courtemanche, so this guy, this was actually my health professor at Georgia State University. He did a really interesting study. He found that, or he estimated that a $1 increase in the price of gas would reduce obesity-related deaths by 16,000 per year and save about $17 billion annually in healthcare costs. So this is pretty interesting, right? Something that you might think, is totally unrelated to health, the price of gas. Okay, but what do you think's going on here? What's causing this reduction in obesity? Why would more expensive gas reduce obesity-related deaths?
That might mean that more people are walking.
Yeah, exactly. That's exactly right. So, yeah, exactly. The main cause was people either switched from driving to walking or biking, or they just took mass transit. But typically with mass transit, right, it doesn't come straight to your door and drop you right off at work. You have to walk to the bus stop, or you have to walk to the train station. So just that little bit extra physical exertion drastically reduced obesity-related deaths. So that's pretty interesting. Good old Chuck Courtemanche, yes. He taught me this class, by the way, at the PhD level. All right, so next, we're going to look at some data on obesity and mortality, right? So what is the relationship basically between BMI and the relative risk of death? And what we're seeing here is the data broken out among males and females. But the pattern is relatively the same. And it's measured in terms of relative risk. So it's all, the data is all normalized to the group with the lowest risk of death, which is, I think in both cases, a BMI of 22 to 23.4. So that's sort of the baseline, right? The lowest risk group. And then all these other groups are relative to that. So for example, let's see, what's a good one to point out? I guess if you look at women that are over 40 BMI, the relative risk, so they're sitting on that second line there. They're twice as likely to die compared to the healthiest group. So that's how we interpret this graph here, or these charts. And then you might be wondering why some bars are wider than others. That basically has to do with statistical certainty. So the bars that are wider, there's less certainty about the relative risk. So if you look at the relative risk for men over 40 BMI, it's really wide. So there's not a lot of certainty there on the relative risk. On average, it's about 2.5, but it could be as low as 1.6, or it could be as high as 4. Okay, so there's a very broad range there. And then the narrower ones, the measurement is more certain. There's less uncertainty. But we see, the same pattern between men and women. And I think one interesting thing to note here is the fact that they're kind of, I guess, U-shaped if you leaned it on its side, right? So not only is being overweight bad for health, but being underweight is bad for health too, right? So that makes sense. Let's see, is there anything else interesting here? Oh, and take note that these are people who never smoked or had a history of disease. Okay, so ignoring anybody that might have smoked, so that we can kind of ignore the complications involved with smoking and try to focus on just obesity. But yeah, not surprising, right? Not too surprising here. Okay, but there are other complications from obesity that aren't just death, right? Morbidity, which basically means sickliness, right? The state of being chronically ill, even though it might not be fatal, right? So obesity is strongly associated with non-fatal diseases, as well as high healthcare costs or high healthcare spending. So things like diabetes, right? It doesn't kill you, at least not immediately. Maybe slowly over time it reduces your lifespan, but it's not fatal, right? But diabetes is heavily associated with obesity and being overweight. Same thing with many types of cancer that are not necessarily fatal. Heart disease, gallbladders, and many others. So there's a high degree of morbidity associated with obesity. And in addition to these sort of non-fatal diseases, orthopedic problems, right? So problems with your knees or your ankles or your hips or your back, right? These things are heavily associated with obesity. People that have knee problems and back problems are typically overweight. In fact, let's see, a study by Kogan et al. In 2001, they estimated that a quarter of all knee surgeries in the United Kingdom could be eliminated if the entire population maintained ideal weights, which basically they defined as BMI under 25. So just some evidence pointing to this orthopedic problem, right? And then in a study looking at the healthcare spending of people that are obese, Finkelstein et al. Estimated that obese people spend about 40% more on healthcare than non-obese people. with obesity-related spending accounting for 10% of all healthcare spending. And when I read this, I was like, oh, well, 10%, that doesn't seem that significant, but that's a big chunk, right? Because you have to keep in mind that there's lots of other reasons for healthcare spending that aren't related to obesity. So, but I think the more impactful finding was that they spend 40% more than people that aren't obese. So that's a good amount. All right. Any questions so far or comments? Okay. So now we're going to move on to tobacco use. So in the last couple of decades, there have been some transitions to like smokeless alternatives, particularly vaping, but vaping wasn't actually that popular when this book was published. But what was popular at the time was hookah. People, for whatever reason, believed that hookah was safer, and I don't know if it's because it gets filtered through a little bit of water, or if it's because it seems less harsh than cigarette smoke, or what it was. But that was like the popular thing when this book was published. Now it's vaping, right? So I'm sure that the 6th edition talks about vaping, but these alternatives are not necessarily safer than smoking cigarettes, even though some people believe that. So that's one thing to think about. And I think probably one of the most interesting things here is the fact that it's pretty well known that cigarette smoke in particular, but tobacco use in general, it's pretty well known that it's bad for your health, right? But people still do it. And so, you might be thinking, oh, well, that's, smoking cigarettes is totally irrational. But we have to keep in mind that it's still a rational choice, because people aren't trying to maximize their health. They're trying to maximize their utility, right? And so, for someone that chooses to smoke, they just get more utility from smoking than the utility cost associated with the decrease in health, right? So it's still a rational choice. So that's interesting to keep in mind. Another thing that might be happening, although I think that this argument is on pretty weak footing, there could be a lack of information that's contributing to the factor, a contributing factor in tobacco use, right? So if people aren't aware of the risks, then they can't really make a sound judgment, right? And I think we talked about this, thinking about like back in the 40s, 50s, and 60s, right? When people didn't really know that smoking was bad for you. And everybody did it. My grandmother smoked. Both my grandmothers smoked. Like, everybody just smoked back in those days. It was like the cool thing to do, and nobody thought, oh, this is probably bad for my health. So I think, that argument may have applied back then, but you can't really make that argument today. And you can to some degree, right? And we will talk about education in a second, but right, you could say that, oh, well, uneducated people might not be aware of the negative health impacts, right? So there might be that going on, but in general, like, it's pretty well public knowledge that smoking and tobacco use are not good for your health. So that's kind of a weak argument there. And like I said, education, right? So education has an inverse or negative relationship with tobacco use. So fewer people smoke that have higher educations than those that have lower educations. And just to put some numbers to that, there was a study in 2009 that found that 26% of people with less than a high school education smoked, as opposed to 11 and 5.6% of those with an undergraduate and graduate education, respectively, right? So much lower rates of use among people with higher education. So, I think this is kind of supporting the information argument, right? People with more information are less likely to smoke. So that's good. All right. Any questions about tobacco use? pretty straightforward, right? Nothing too surprising there. We might find some more interesting, surprising things here with alcohol use that you may not have been aware of. So here's some not surprising things. Heavy drinking is worse than light drinking. Not surprising. What you might not be aware of is that binge drinking, which is different from heavy drinking, it's very heavy drinking, but kind of randomly and sporadically. So not every day or anything like that, like maybe like once a month or so, something like that. But binge drinking has separate and distinct negative effects from heavy drinking. So even though they seem like they might have similar effects, they actually have somewhat distinct effects. So that's the first interesting sort of thing. Now, here's something that is interesting to me, at least. The type of alcoholic beverage seems to make a difference. So beer and distilled spirits, so like hard alcohol, like vodka and gin and rum, have negative health effects. But it's been pretty strongly determined that wine actually has positive health effects. So when you crack open a bottle of wine and someone gives you a hard time for it, just tell them that you're benefiting your health. And I think it mainly has to do with the antioxidant qualities of wine. Wine is an antioxidant, and it can help prevent cancer as well as other things. It helps reduce the risk of heart disease as well. So that's pretty interesting, and you may not have thought of that. And another interesting thing is the relationship between education and alcohol use. You might think that people with higher education drink less, similarly to tobacco use, but it's actually the opposite. People with higher education actually drink more, but they tend to drink more wine and less beer and hard alcohol. So while we're seeing something that it looks like education might have an opposite effect here to tobacco, it's actually not opposite. It's the same. More educated people choose the healthier type of alcoholic beverage, even though they drink more than people with lower educations. And we have to be careful here. I think probably the main reason is that these people are making more money, and so they can afford more alcohol, right? But they're not just drinking more alcohol; they're drinking the better type of alcohol, which is wine, in this case, right? The better alcohol for your health. So that's pretty interesting. Yeah, and that's basically what I just said. So alcohol and education has a little bit more of a complicated, or I guess just alcohol consumption in general is a little bit more complicated, and has some effects that you might not have thought of before. So to kind of continue on this, here's some data on education and alcohol use. And then it's broken down into different categories in terms of type of drinking, right? So binge drinking, heavy alcohol use, or just regular light drinking, I guess. So as you can see, right, there definitely is a trend upward, right? So there's a positive relationship between education and the amount of alcohol consumed. And I guess this isn't exactly amount of alcohol, it's the number of people drinking. Okay, so the percentage of the population in each group that is drinking. So almost 60% of college graduates drank in the past month, as opposed to 35% of those with less than a high school education. So that's pretty clear. And then the other clear trend is the fact that binge drinking and heavy drinking are a smaller fraction of that drinking, and it's more, as education increases, it's people that are drinking more or less normally, right, as opposed to heavy or binge drinking. And then when you combine this data with the fact that people with higher educations tend to drink more wine and less beer and spirits, then you get this sort of interaction effect that tells us that people with higher education are still making decisions that are better for their health, right? Even though it might appear opposite at first when just looking at this data alone. Right. So that, I think that's basically what I just said, right? Although the relationship between education and alcohol and tobacco use seem to be opposite, they actually run in the same direction, right? Better education translates into better health choices. There's also some other interesting effects of alcohol use. And again, they are somewhat complicated. So there are some effects of alcohol consumption on lifetime earnings. And you might think at first that the effect is mainly driven through people that drink more, particularly binge drinking and heavy drinking, earn less money, like their wage is lower. But that's actually not the case. The thing that's driving lower lifetime earnings for binge drinkers and heavy drinkers is the fact that their labor force participation rate is lower over their lifetime. So they're working for about the same wage, but they work fewer years in the course of their life, which makes sense, I think, because probably pretty much because of the negative health impacts, right? When you're not healthy, you can't work, right? So yeah, so the lower lifetime earnings are being driven by labor force participation, not by wage, which is kind of interesting. All right. Any questions so far? I know I'm throwing a lot of information at you. Hopefully it's sticking. All right, so the last thing we're going to talk about is education and health. And we've already been talking about it, right, with regard to tobacco use and alcohol use. So that's not the only place that education is important, though. Education also plays a role in obesity, particularly for women. So women that have a higher education tend to fall into the obese category less. Now, education is particularly difficult. So I don't know if any of you have had econometrics. Has anybody had econometrics? Okay, cool. That's awesome. So in economics, we have to be really careful because usually what we're trying to investigate are causal relationships, right? How does education cause health outcomes? Or any other type of relationship. But in many cases, it's hard to pin down a causal relationship. And the best that we can do is say that there's an association, right? Which when we say that there's an association, we're basically admitting that we don't know what direction the causality flows. Is it that people that have higher educations make better health choices because of their education? Or is there something underlying? Is there an underlying cause to both, right? And so it can be hard to pin down education as the cause of good health. It's obvious that there's an association, right? There's definitely an association between education and health. It's just not clear if there's a causal relationship. So there was one study or one, I don't know if it was a study or just an argument made by an economist, but this economist basically made the argument that there's a good chance that it's not necessarily that education causes good health. It might be more likely that something underlying both of those decisions is causing both of those things, and that's why there's the association, right? And what he was arguing was that there's differences in time preferences or the discount rate, right? So some people are very impatient, so they have a high discount rate. They want immediate gratification. Other people have lower discount rates and are patient, right? They can wait a longer amount of time for payoffs. So people that are typically impatient have low discount rates. They're the people that don't want to make an investment in education. They want to get out there and start making money right now, right? So that's because of the discount rate. That same discount rate, that same time preference might also be why they choose to smoke cigarettes, because smoking a cigarette is a very immediate, um, benefit, I guess, right? The high from the nicotine is immediate, whereas the health effects are very long term and prolonged. So someone with a low discount rate that's impatient is going to maybe not get a higher education and might do things like smoke cigarettes or drink heavily, because and both of these things are being caused by the discount rate, right? Whereas someone with a lower discount rate that is more patient is more willing to invest in their education, and they're also less likely to do things like smoke cigarettes because they focus more on the long-term negative effects rather than the positive short-term effects. And so again, this is like one complication in trying to figure out the causal relationship. But a problem with that is it's hard to measure discount rates. So that's another issue, right? And then the lifetime earnings aspect also makes this issue more complicated, because people with higher educations earn more money and therefore can earn, or rather can afford, better health care, and afford healthier lifestyles. On the sort of flip side of that, they can also eat out more, right, at restaurants, which is not healthy. But I think maybe the other stuff might outweigh that. I'm not sure, but again, this complicates this issue of the relationship between education and health. Similarly, those with chronic health problems have lower lifetime earnings, right? So sort of flowing in the opposite direction. Those that already have the ailments earn less money. They might also be less likely to go to school because of their ailment and things like that. So while the relationship between education and health is pretty complicated, at least we can say that there's a strong association, even though we might not be able to pin down the causal relationship. Which one causes the other, or are they both caused by something else, like time preferences, right? So that's something, right, that's for econometrics to try to solve. And there's different econometric techniques to try to find out what the impact of education is on health. So I don't know if you guys did instrumental variables analysis. Yeah, maybe not. I'll just talk about it briefly. So that's where, right, if you just had data on education and then health outcomes, and did a regression, the results would arguably not indicate a causal relationship, right? Most economists would say, okay, yes, you've proven that there's a positive association, but you haven't proven that that there's a causal relationship, because basically what we have is called an endogeneity problem. Okay, it could be that the two variables are causing each other, so there's like a dual causality going on, or it could be that there's an underlying cause, like time preferences, that's causing both of these things, and that's where the association is coming from. And so instrumental variable analysis is a way to try to get around this. And the way that it works is you try to find something that's exogenous, so something that's not related to health but might affect education levels. So something that's commonly used as an instrumental variable regarding education is compulsory education laws in different states, right? So in Alabama, you have to go to school until you're 13. In Washington State, you have to go to school until you're 17. And then over time, those ages have changed because of changes in the law. So that's something that's exogenous, right? That is affecting education, but probably not affecting health. And so we can include this in our analysis to try to get at a causal relationship between education and health. Anyway, that's for an advanced econometrics class. So I won't talk any more about that. But we will wrap up this chapter. Okay, so in summary, oops, I forgot to edit that one thing. Feature content, lorem ipsum dolor sit amet. Just some filler material. You can ignore that. So just to recap this whole chapter, right? We started off by looking at the consumer choice of healthcare in terms of the utility framework that we are hopefully familiar with from our intro and intermediate micro courses, right? We assume that people are trying to maximize utility and they make choices accordingly, right? So that's sort of the framework that we use. But of course, it's a little bit more complicated than just normal utility theory, because not only does health directly affect your utility, it also indirectly affects your utility, because going to the zoo is more enjoyable when you are feeling good as opposed to when when you have a headache or are hungover. And then on top of that, our choices of consumption can affect our health, right? So when we eat fast food, that directly affects our utility, but it also affects our health, which in turn affects our utility. So it's a little bit more complicated, right? But it's the it's the utility maximization approach. And then we also looked at the production of health through healthcare and thought of it as a production function, which is kind of unusual in consumer choice, but it's a good way of thinking about it. Health as a stock, as an asset that depreciates, and that we can consume healthcare to try to re-up our health, right? And then, of course, we looked at the impact of lifestyle choices, very important, as we saw in those causes of death tables. And then we looked at in detail today at sort of some particular lifestyle choices, right? Obesity, tobacco and alcohol use, and education. And we saw that, tobacco use was pretty predictable, right? The causes of tobacco, the effects of tobacco use are pretty predictable, and the effect of education on tobacco use is pretty predictable. But then we saw that alcohol use is a little bit more nuanced, right? These differences between types of alcohol, as well as the frequency and intensity at which somebody drinks, right? So alcohol use isn't as straightforward necessarily as tobacco use, but some pretty interesting things there that we saw. And then I guess the main takeaway from all of that is that overall, education is positively associated with health, right? So let's see, I think that's it. Okay. Any questions about chapter 2? Okay, cool. Let's see, let me get the other chapter pulled up here. Hold on. Having an issue here. Not really sure what's going on. Slideshow. If I just do this. Nope. For some reason, it's not letting me put it into presenter mode. There we go. Okay, got it. Okay, cool. So we're going to kind of continue on this same path here as far as consumer choice of utility. But we're going to think about we're going to think more about that production function, right? The production function for health. So how medical care is transformed into health, right? And we can kind of focus on a couple of things here. So the first thing we want to understand here is how the amount of medical care translates into health, right? So that's kind of like the direct effect that we're interested in looking at. But then what we're also interested in is learning about the predictability of outcomes, right? So thinking back to chapter 1, right? Uncertainty is very prevalent in healthcare. And part of that is understanding the probabilities of certain outcomes, or the predictability of certain outcomes, right? If, I know that if I have surgery, there is a positive probability that it will kill me, right? It's supposed to make me better, but with any surgery, there's a risk of death or further injury. And so we'd like to be able to as accurately as we can predict what the outcomes of a particular type of medical care will be. So that's kind of the two frameworks that we'll be thinking within are these. So we're going to start out with the first one, just understanding how amounts of medical care translate into health. So as always, some learning objectives here for you. Okay, so the first thing you want to focus on is understanding the meaning of marginal productivity and understanding the difference between average and marginal productivity, as well as the meaning of extensive and intensive margins. So the first half of this goal hopefully should be familiar, right? Thinking about averages versus margins. That's something you should have covered in your intro to micro course already. What you probably haven't heard before, though, are the meanings of extensive and intensive margins, and we're going to talk about those in detail. So medical care in particular has these sorts of features. We also want to review estimates of productivity of medical care in producing health at an aggregate level. So looking at all medical care, right? So remember that aggregate means total, right? Hopefully you remember that from your macro course, if you've taken macro. But one way we can look at the evidence is on an aggregate level. So that's one thing we're going to do is review that evidence. But that's not the only way we want to look at things. We want to look also at examples in healthcare of the marginal productivity of specific interventions. So not all interventions, but specific medical interventions, and particularly with a focus on cost effectiveness, right? So that's really when we start looking at specific medical procedures. One thing we're going to be looking at is cost effectiveness, right? Which of course should be eliciting the concept of efficiency, right? Getting the most bang for our buck, essentially. And also being able to relate these cost effectivenesses to extensive and intensive margins and how there might be a difference between those margins. We also want to look at how there might be differences between different regions, right? So cross-regional medical practice variations. Which can point us to the fact that providers, doctors, right, may not always agree on when to use various medical interventions. There might be some disagreement, right? And again, this goes along with the theme of uncertainty, right? Even doctors don't always know what's wrong with you or what the best course of action is as far as treatment goes. And there's a wide variety of opinions. And there seems to be some correlations that are regional, which is kind of interesting. So we'll look at that. And then we also want to learn about how even within a single region, right, even just focusing on, say, the metro Atlanta area, even within a small region, there's still variations that can occur. So we're going to talk about that too. Okay. But first of all, we're going to kind of have a little bit of a refresher here, a little bit of review. Okay, so remember that when we were talking about medical care being translated into health, we're approaching this as a production function, right? Where health is the output and medical care is the input. So that was our function there. And we, if we graphed it, it might look something like this, right? So we've got total product, which is health, right? The increase in health as a function of medical care. And so we want to start off by remembering the difference between marginal and average productivity. And then we're going to talk about these differences between extensive margin and intensive margin. And then once we understand those differences, the rest of the chapter is basically just looking at different types of evidence on the productivity of medical care. So this is kind of an outline for the rest of the chapter, but we'll start with this review here. So your book talks about the production of grapes, right? So something that is more in line with actual production. And the assumption that we make here is that the production of grapes is a function of labor, right? So we might have a worker picking grapes, but they have a certain level of productivity. that productivity might increase if we add another worker, right? Because what happens when we add another worker? They can specialize, right? So maybe one person focuses on picking the grapes and another person focuses on taking the grapes back to wherever they're stored, right? And so hopefully you remember, and if you don't, no big deal, we're reviewing it right now. Hopefully you remember the difference between average and marginal, okay? So in this example, the average product of labor, APL, would be the total amount of grapes produced divided by the total amount of labor, right? So that you're getting an average. How many grapes are produced per worker? How much on average does each worker produce, right, in terms of grapes? So that's average. But we know that that's different from marginal productivity, right? So particularly in this case where we add another worker and the two workers can then specialize, in those cases, typically the marginal product is higher, right? So typically at first we see marginal product increasing, and then it starts to level off, and then eventually it declines, right? So at low levels of labor, adding another worker can actually make all of the other workers more productive, right? So an increasing marginal product. But eventually that sort of wears out a little bit. There's not as much specialization to go around. So we can continue to add more workers, and yes, it continues to allow us to make more grapes. So the marginal product is still positive, but it's starting to get lower, right? There's diminishing marginal product. And then at some point, given a fixed plot of land, at some point, if we continue to add workers, they're just going to get in each other's way. They might start stepping on grapes and destroying products. So at some point, if we add enough workers, the marginal product actually might start to become negative, right? And a rational business owner would never hire that much labor. We would never want to get to a point where production starts going down. But theoretically, that would happen at some point, right? So, hopefully you're remembering the difference between average and marginal product here. So, for us in our context, it's pretty similar, right? So the average product of medical care would be the total production of medical care divided by the amount of medical care. That would be average product for medical care. Whereas marginal product of medical care would be what's the incremental change in health given an incremental change in medical care, right? So, so hopefully this is review. Hopefully this seems familiar to you. Are there any questions about that in case we're not all on the same page? Don't be afraid if you're not to say something. We're all good? Okay. So that should be familiar to you. What's not familiar probably though are these ideas of extensive margin versus intensive margin. So sort of the best way to think about extensive margin is it's a measure of productivity based on the of healthcare utilized. So your book talks about cancer screening with mammograms. Breast cancer is most prevalent in women over the age of 50. So as a society, we might say, okay, well, since it's most prevalent in women over 50, let's just limit cancer screenings to that age group, right? But we could expand the extensive margin. We could start to include women who are younger and screen those women, right? That would be expanding the extensive margin. More people are getting breast cancer screenings. Okay, so that's the idea behind the extensive margin. And just like marginal productivity that we talked about earlier, typically, marginal productivity is positive and it may even increase, right? So, as we screen more women, we find more cases of cancer and can do something about it. But if we continue screening younger and younger women, at some point, the productivity, the marginal productivity might actually become negative because with mammograms, there is a low dose of radiation. And so if we're screening women that are, say, in their early 20s, there's a very low chance that they have breast cancer, right? But there is a chance that by giving them a mammogram, because there's radiation involved, that might actually induce them to have breast cancer at an earlier age. Okay, so we can think of, we still have this marginal relationship, right? This type of relationship with marginal productivity where it's increasing at first, but at some point it might actually become negative, right? It wouldn't make any sense to screen like 5-year-old girls, right? Why put them under radiation when their risk of breast cancer is almost zero, right? There would be no point in doing that, and it would actually maybe be harmful, right? So, that's the way that we're thinking about extensive margin, right? More people undergoing a treatment or a screening, okay? So we might also think about that in terms of some medical treatments like back surgery, right? So back surgery is one way to alleviate back pain. So here's some statistics on that. While 65 to 80% of people will experience back pain in their life, only 2% get back surgery. And on top of that, the success rate varies, and it seems to vary regionally, which is interesting. But this may have something to do with what's called case selection. Some doctors are more aggressive in recommending back surgery, right? So some doctors want to push the extensive margin and say, hey, you really need back surgery, even though I'm not really sure if it's going to help you. Whereas some doctors are a little bit more conservative and say, I'm only going to recommend back surgery if I'm really confident it's going to help you have less back pain, right? But again, so what we're really thinking about is the number of people receiving the treatment. That's the extensive margin, okay? Any questions about that? Okay. So like I said, we can think of the extensive margin as the number of people receiving treatment, but medical care can also be adjusted on the intensive margin. And with the intensive margin, we're basically holding the number of people getting the treatment constant, but we are making their treatment more intense, right? So rather than getting a screening once a year, you're getting screened 4 times a year, right? So the extensive margin hasn't changed, right? It's still the same number of women being screened for breast cancer, but now of that group, they are all being screened more often. Okay, so that's the intensive margin. And just like the extensive margin, the intensive margin can have first increasing, then decreasing, and then perhaps eventually negative marginal productivity, right? So the same type of relationship that we saw here in this graph, right? So increasing marginal productivity, declining marginal productivity, and then negative. Okay, so this is something that's kind of unique to medical care. We don't really talk about extensive versus intensive margin in other forms of production, although I guess we could. I'm not sure what that would entail, but anyway. So this is something kind of unique to medical care. Okay, we're running out of time here, so I'll just talk about where we're going to pick up next time on Monday. So from here on out for the rest of the chapter, we're basically going to be looking at evidence. So we're going to start by looking at aggregate productivity of healthcare. So overall, looking at all medical care. And then we're going to look at something called we're going to start looking at randomized control trials, which is kind of the very scientific way of approaching these questions, looking at evidence. Randomizing people, right? So this is exactly what they did with the vaccine trials, right? They basically had a group of people. Half of them got the actual vaccine, half of them got a placebo, and it was randomized. So that's basically what we're talking about, is something like that when we talk about RCTs. And then after RCTs, we're going to look at specific treatments, right? So focus in on things like, back surgery or heart transplant, things like that. And then we'll wrap up looking at more finely grained outcome measures. And then there's some other things towards the end of the chapter that we will kind of summarize all of these findings, and that'll be it. So hopefully, I think we'll get all the way through the rest of this chapter on Monday, which is good because that's what our schedule is. But this is where we'll pick up from on Monday. Any questions? We're out of time, but I'll take any questions if anyone has a question. No? All right. Well, if there's no questions from anybody, feel free to head on out. Have a good weekend, and I'll see you on Monday. Bye.